for a look at a new twist to formal bedding Gardener's World at 7:40. First on BBC Two, Katie Durham introduces this week's Proms Extra.
Tonight we have 2 pieces from 10 pieces. We raise our voices with a child of our time, and we meet the new leaders of the classical pack. It could only be Proms Extra. Hello and welcome to Proms Extra. If the Proms season is a designer label, then we are the high street equivalent, giving you the latest updates on what's been happening just across the road. Take a look at these catwalk performances.
This is ground control to Major Tom. You really made a grade, and the papers want to know who shirt you wear. Now it's time to leave the capsule if you dare. Read it.
And that's just a regular week in the life of the Proms. Overlooking the hall is our studio in the Royal College of Music, and Proms Extra just isn't the same without some guests. Joining me tonight, this guest is one of the UK's top mezzo-sopranos. One reviewer described her as being sensational, labelling her a terrifying dominatrix in her role in The Valkyrie for Opera North. She's no stranger to the Proms, and she's no longer a stranger to Proms Extra. It's a very warm welcome to Susan Bickley. Our next sofa guest is one of the few contemporary composers who has had his own prom night. He's an award-winning multi-instrumentalist, producer, writer and broadcaster who's worked with the biggest names in pop, classical, dance, film and theatre. He's also a world-class DJ, which will come in very handy for the Proms Extra Wrap Party. Welcome to Nitin Sawhney. And talking of parties, our final guest has started to make his mark as one of the new and exciting composers to come out of the UK. And to celebrate his latest work, he's kindly invited everyone to join him for a noisy, wild, raucous party that will raise the roof in London in South Ken. In other words, he has a world premiere being performed in the Royal Albert Hall for the last night of the Proms. Please welcome Tom Harrold. And performing at the end of the show is Oliver Coates, one of the UK's in-demand solo cellists. Well, welcome all of you. Susan, fresh from your prom, performing in A Child of Our Time. How was that?
It was, of course, an exciting experience, but it always is to sing at the Albert Hall. But to be surrounded by the choir and the BBC National Orchestra of Wales, who played wonderfully, and that choir who surrounded us and cushioned us with an amazing sound was a privilege.
Very moving. We'll be talking more about that work and that prom later. But Nitin, you're no stranger to the Proms at all. You even had your own back in 2007, and then the Human Planet prom as well. I mean, it's quite something, that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's amazing, and I've performed at the Royal Albert Hall many times. It's to be honest, it's my favourite venue in the world. It's always got such a sense of occasion being performing there, and actually for the Human Planet series, I originally also recorded with the National Orchestra of Wales as well. So it was great to see them performing on Saturday, Child of Our Time. That was great.
Now, Tom, how are you feeling? How terrified are you so far about the last night of the proms?
Terrified is not the right word. Very excited, extremely excited about it. You know, it's an incredible opportunity and an incredible gig to get, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what the Proms Youth Ensemble do with it, and Zachary Rammel and BBC Symphony Orchestra. I'm very, very excited.
Can you give us any clues about the work?
It starts loud, stays loud, and gets louder.
Nice. I'm seeing what you're aiming for there. Well, very, very good to have you all here. Now, the Proms does try to have something for everybody, for the purists, for the adventurous, for the curious, and for the kids. This season, the teenies have the CBeebies Proms to look forward to over the bank holiday weekend in August. And last week, for the older ones, 10 Pieces made a welcome return to the hall. Now, 10 Pieces is the BBC initiative to encourage children to be inspired by classical music by listening to 10 pieces of repertoire and responding creatively. Last year it was aimed at the primary school children. This year it was the turn of the secondary school kids. And Nitin, you're an ambassador for 10 Pieces, and it's been a huge success. Were you impressed by what the kids had come up with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very exciting to be engaging with young people who are going to be inspired by the 10 Pieces. I mean, last year I was working at a school, Mary Magdalene School, where I was actually working with young people and getting them to look at ideas based around the Wagner piece. So it's been great to be involved on a practical level and to really kind of encourage people to listen to those pieces.
Well, let's have a listen to one of the featured pieces at the prom. Here is Shostakovich's Symphony No. 10. The BBC Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by rising talent Alpesh Chauhan, with Shostakovich's Symphony No. 10, accompanied by a creative response from dancers from Wilton School in Southampton. Nitin, you said you'd already worked with some young people this sort of age. Is it a tricky age to engage with classical music?
Not really, because I think they were very open to it. But I think it also, that piece was very powerful. It's quite a rousing piece, and they can hear, something they can identify with in terms of the riff or the motif that keeps coming back, and it feels exhilarating. It feels like an exciting piece. So the energy of it, I think, is quite infectious. But I think overall, it hasn't been difficult to talk to young people about the 10 pieces, and they've been very excited when they have talked about it.
It's always key, isn't it, to choose the right words? I mean, the Shostakovich we heard there, I mean, there's a big story behind it. You can really get involved in the context. I mean, so when you've been working with young people, have you found that's been the way to really get them sparked up?
I'm really interested in the cross-curricular boundaries being broken down, actually, for kids to know what was going on around that time that helped the composer write the piece, but also what art was being done at that time. Not only the historical context, but everything that was going, the science that was being done. I think that's the way forward to encourage and inspire children. And I have to say that they obviously had great discussions and working on that dance that they did, which I thought was fabulous.
Yeah. I think that's very important as well, that children understand that it's about storytelling and about expression, and that music should be an extension of your identity and your feelings and your thoughts and ideas. And that's and so it's great to actually contextualise this sort of music as well.
Tom, you're writing a piece for the Proms Youth Ensemble for the last night of the Proms. How's that going to work?
Well, the first rehearsal starts, it's in about a week's time. So I think what we'll do is we'll try and build up this working relationship together, and to really see, I mean, I write the piece so they can make it theirs, so they have some sort of ownership to it. That's really important to me as a composer, and all the work that I do with all the artists that I work with and all the groups, that they have an ownership and they can really put their own identity on it. I'm not going to be precious if they want to do something a bit different with it or have their own interpretation. It's really important that they do their own thing, and with the Shostakovich, it's so easy for them to have their own interpretation of the story, their own interpretation of what's going on, which is why it's such a strong piece for 10 pieces, I think.
Were you inspired, like they have been, in 10 pieces when you were that sort of age? Did you have anybody who was a real kind of catalyst for your interest in classical music?
Yeah, I mean, I remember going to the Scheme Children's Classic concerts in Glasgow, and I don't know if they're still going on, but I suppose it's in a similar kind of vein as 10 pieces. And I remember going to the Glasgow Royal Concert Hall and seeing an orchestra and being narrated through what was going on. and being absolutely inspired by it. And I mean, it really planted the seed with me, as I'm sure 10 Pieces is doing. Exactly the same.
What got you inspired in the first place, Sue?
I was thinking actually very much about the fact that when I was a child, my father was also a musician, a school teacher, but a musician. But we watched Fantasia. We went to see Fantasia, and it's am I wrong in thinking it's a similar thing in that there were lots of short pieces of music with a visual, which helped when you were a young child.
Yeah, I mean, that's just, I mean, for me, I loved, I mean, I'm a film composer, and I loved, you know, listening to and watching great film composers like Bernard Herrmann. I mean, I should have probably been watching Psycho when I was as young as I was, but somehow I ended up watching it one night. And I think I was about 10 or 11, and I was absolutely blown away by, I mean, Bernard Herrmann, of course, was really influenced by Stravinsky, and you can hear the use of it's almost the application of Stravinsky's mind to film when you see that incredible partnership between Bernard Herrmann and Alfred Hitchcock.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, it's slightly more disturbing possibly than The Sorcerer's Apprentice, but I don't know. But it's all part of the
Pretty
same.
scary when you're young, Sorcerer's Apprentice.
Put me off sweeping for a while and mopping.
I'm still allergic, it's all right.
Well, we're not done with 10 Pieces just yet, as one of the other featured pieces, Vaughan Williams's gorgeous The Lark Ascending, is about to fly high with David Owen Norris and his chord of the week.
The chord that underpins The Lark Ascending. Vaughan Williams gives his lark, the solo violin, only 5 notes of the scale, the pentatonic mode that underlies so much of the folk music he'd been collecting. It's as if the lark is the voice of the countryside itself. There's a curious emptiness about the chord. Most chords have a note 3 notes up from the bass, but this chord has no third. If it did, it'd sound like this. Yet anyone who knows this lovely piece would have had that low G in mind all along. You might even have thought I was missing something out when I played our chord of the week. Because Vaughan Williams has put the G in our mind right at the beginning of the piece, before the soloist comes in, down in the second violins. They play it, and then they leave it. The colour of the harmony depends on us remembering that G, remembering something that's no longer there. Nostalgia. Vaughan Williams has composed nostalgia into the very first moments of the piece. He put the first draft away in a drawer when he signed up to the army in August 1914, and he didn't finish it till he came home in 1919. That remembered G has come to signify a whole lost world.
Beautiful explanation by David Owen Norris, followed by the wonderful SDU on violin, performing The Lark Ascending, accompanied by the BBC Philharmonic and conducted by Alpesh Chauhan, with students from Bangor School in Northern Ireland. And Tom, seeing those young lads there in uniform, it really does make that piece of music feel even more powerful. I mean, it's always a beautiful listen, always charming, but it really sets that sort of dark and political tone to it as well, doesn't it?
How could they get more poignant? What a contrast, this beautiful music and the absolute horrors of war.
So this is seen as melancholic and nostalgic. It's also seen to be quintessentially English, very pastoral. How do you respond to it?
Well, I was reading in a programme note, I think, that there were 2 versions of his inspiration for this piece, that it was thinking about the young men going off to war, but he also apparently wrote it when he was staying on holiday in Margate, which is just down the coast from where I live, and looking out at the sky over the sea, I can well see how he was inspired, because when we can, we do that every single night, look at the sunset.
It's interesting because there's a dark side to that as well, because a boy actually saw him on that occasion writing and thought he was writing secret messages and reported him as being a German spy. So he was arrested.
And he was arrested,
on that occasion. But it's interesting, all of this, because after that, after the war, he revised the piece, and he'd been a stretcher bearer during the course of the war. So you kind of wonder how those experiences would have impacted on the revision of the music. And I find it very powerful, because also it reminds me a lot of this pentatonic scale is also known in India, for example, as Rag Malkons. And Yehudi Menuhin very famously performed with Ravi Shankar, Panditji Ravi Shankar. And Panditji Ravi Shankar was a master of the rag, and I remember him performing Rag Malkons really poignantly. And it has that same depth with all these trills as well, and these in the violin solo. It's just gorgeous, and the way it's set up with a drone sound almost, in the same way an Indian classical piece would be. I think it gives it a lot more depth.
I suppose it's the space he's left the violin, and just to kind of be a violin and be a beautiful instrument, and the fact that he stays so harmonically consistent the whole way through. I mean, it almost makes it more poignant that he's created this soundscape.
Draws you in.
Yeah, completely. Over which the violin can sort of do its thing.
It's very interesting hearing you talk about the influences on different composers, though, because we know, of course, how much Vaughan Williams loved folk music, and he and many of his colleagues at that time went and collected old English tunes, didn't they? Which, one could argue you could hear in that. I mean, how much do you, in your work, how much do you pull upon sort of music of the people, if you like?
Well, I think, it's very important to me to draw on all kinds of different forms. I mean, for example, I'm a flamenco guitarist. I play a lot of classical piano and jazz piano and so on, but I play a lot of flamenco and different forms of guitar as well. And flamenco, for me, is a form of music that's been elevated over time to almost a classical form. It originally was a folk form from Rajasthan in India, and it started that way, and it developed and picked up Moorish traditions, and over time, it's in the hands of people like Paco de Lucia or Tomatito, it became a much more elevated form. And it's interesting because originally there was a lot of protests from people like Andres Segovia, who said that he wanted to take the guitar away from the noisy hands of the flamenco guitarist. And, it's interesting when you see a folk form that rises above those initial prejudices against the musicians. I think that's wonderful.
You can find the 10 Pieces Prom with a full repertoire on the BBC iPlayer and online. Still to come on Proms Extra, a look at A Child of Our Time by Tibbet and a performance by cellist Oliver Coates. Now, Nitin, a question for you. When you started composing, did you feel like you were breaking down boundaries?
I think when you're composing a piece, you don't think about the aftermath of of what happens when you've composed it or when it's heard. You're just thinking about the feeling at the time, and you have to be very present-minded and really follow the flow of what you feel. It's different if you're writing for a commission or if you're writing for yourself. It's just about a flow of feeling and channeling what is around you and trying to give it a voice.
Do you label yourself as a certain type of composer? Are you a classical contemporary composer?
I hate labels. I mean, but I suppose I've worked in so many different genres, and I work in film, I work in television, I work as a composer, for classical orchestras as well. I've done lots of different things, so I don't really like labels. I mean, I like working as a DJ as well, so it doesn't, labels just restrict your imagination and possibility.
Well, you'll like this next film. There continues to be a new wave of young contemporary composers emerging who are making classical music their own way. And Proms Extra hit the decks with one composer in particular.
Classical music is such an important part of human culture in the whole world now, but often it feels like it's hiding itself in a bit of a bubble and has become a kind of historical art form for some people or a highbrow academic art form for others. I see myself as a classical composer. I'm writing music that reflects the world I live in. I want to share it with my peer group. And so the solution for me was to put it on in clubs and bars where most people go for music. And instantly, the public's more relaxed and they don't feel like they have to behave in any particular way. And if they don't like the piece, they're not stuck in a seat. They can just go to the bar and get a drink. When you bring in electronics into classical music, it's important that you make it interactive with the live performers. So with the cello multitracks, a score has freedom in it. It just tells the cellist to play certain phrases, which is actually imitating sounds of recorded cello, and then I then imitate the live cello back. So it's this circular feedback loop between us. I'm not trying to make pop music dressed up with a classical instrumentation. I'm more interested in the deeper essence or energy of contemporary culture and how that, and taking that on board into a serious classical composition. People always ask me, they said, oh, would your grandfather have approved of you using electronic instruments? You know, would he have, do you think he would have made electronic music? When we look at the history of classical music, you see technology evolving. You know, Mozart wrote his clarinet concerto for early models of the clarinet. We're always looking for new sounds. I think that's just totally natural that a composer will, when there's a new way of making sounds, they'll take that on board. So I think there is this new strand of classical music that's connecting with electronic music that's perhaps, you know, has a closer connection with contemporary life as well and contemporary culture.
That was composer Gabriel Prokofiev, whose work is also featured in the 10 Pieces Prom, is one of many classical composers doing it their way. And Tom, did that resonate with you, hearing Gabriel talk about his inspiration, what he's trying to achieve?
Yeah, I think it's really important for composers to stay current and to stay engaged in your community and to really sort of demystify the compositional process. It's really, really, really an important thing for us to do this, and I have utmost respect for Gabriel to be doing this. And I know a lot of my colleagues from the Royal Northern College of Music also have similar sort of nights where they put on contemporary music in pubs, clubs, and venues where you wouldn't expect contemporary music to be. And I think it's absolutely fantastic. I think it is the future.
Nitin, do you feel there's an appetite for it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm really into decontextualization. If you decontextualize classical music, you hear it in a different way, and you come to it with a different perspective. And I think if you make it more accessible to people who wouldn't come across it otherwise. I mean, years ago, I remember I'd written a piece for the Britten Sinfonia, and a few days later, I was DJing at a club called Fabric in London. And I remember there was a guy who was dancing in front of me. He said, "Oh, I saw you with the Britten Sinfonia a few days ago," and I thought that was great because there was somebody who would actually come and seen something that was totally different. And I like that idea that people can engage in lots of different ways with music and don't have those kind of preconceptions that music is only, certain types of music can be only for a certain audience.
And so I understand you studied electronic music. Back in the day.
Back in the day, yeah, it was in the day. It was in the late 70s. So when I went to City University, and the degree there included an element of electronic music. So, but I mean, there was nothing digital about it really at that point. So we're talking about tapes and cutting tapes and splicing tapes and that. But there were some really cutting-edge composers at the time. Alejandro Viñao, who's an Argentinian composer, was there. Simon Emerson was one of our tutors, and they were all very involved in the contemporary music scene. And I got very involved also in the contemporary music scene, but not necessarily electronics. But we did work alongside them at that time.
Because you do a lot of contemporary repertoire. I know that you're working constantly with composers on new works, aren't you?
I have done a lot of contemporary music, yes, and it's a huge challenge. Sometimes I think, oh, maybe I won't. No, yes, I will actually, because it's great to feel that you're part of a new history of music, actually.
And do you notice an evolving sound world? Do you think that there are real changes you could sort of document, if you like?
Well, actually, in recent times, it's come back to being more melodic. Contemporary music, I find. I don't know whether you think the same thing, but there was a point when it became quite obscure and not very helpful to listeners, really. And now I think there are elements of. It doesn't mean that it's easier for listeners, but it challenges them in a different way.
I also like it when, with people like Gabriel Prokofiev, where he's mixing electronic music with classical music and live players. I really like that because it's a natural evolution from, people who compose would know packages on computers called Logic or Sibelius, where you'll actually use these to compose for orchestras, but they also allow you to bring in other sounds and other kinds kind of flavours into your work, and it's inevitable that happens. And sometimes you want to blend the two, and you know, I find myself doing that more and more.
It's also nice to see something active as well. I mean, there used to be a time when electronic music, you'd sit in the audience and just listen to it. But there's actually more to see as well. People working at it and doing it live, which I think is incredibly exciting and much more involving for the audience.
It must be because the technology's so incredible now. I mean, you moved on from the tape that you were doing. I mean, I dabble in it a bit, but you can do anything with the electronic music.
Yes.
Absolutely anything.
Yes.
And I think that's why it's such a good 10 pieces piece. You know, you're showing young people how kind of cool an orchestra can be. And I use that word in the best possible way. You can show that it's the crossover between the two works so well.
Yes.
I think that's why it's such a good piece for 10 pieces.
I agree.
From new music to a piece that is a modern classic, Tippett's A Child of Our Time. Let's have a look at an excerpt from the work. A Child of Our Time, shown on BBC4 last Sunday, and what you saw there was one of the 5 spirituals that Tippett included in his setting. So I wish I'd been in the hall. It looked absolutely tremendous, very, very moving. How did you prepare yourself to immerse yourself in such a very moving work?
Well, you don't need to go very far from reading what's going on in the newspapers these days to actually make that sort of contextual contact. And it was an incredibly intense evening, actually. You can always tell how engaged audiences are by how quiet they are. There's no coughing or anything like that. And I think it was incredibly intense. And in that extraordinary and amazing acoustic, it reverberates even more.
I think
you were there.
I was actually there on the night, and it was wonderful watching you sing. I thought you sounded incredible, and the whole piece was so moving. I found it's interesting because originally T.S. Eliot was going to be writing the libretto, and he turned it down, and it ended up being Tippett writing it himself. But it's such a powerful libretto. There's one phrase I've actually got here, which is described in part 2 of the piece as chorus of the self-righteous, and it says, "We cannot have them in our empire. They shall not work nor draw a dole. Let them starve in no man's land." Incredibly powerful, still pertinent, and still very poignant.
Certainly what I find is that the way that Tippett's able to build up this tension and then use the 5 spirituals to be able to sort of release this tension. It's like everyone sort of sighs when they sort of feel like they're almost home. And I find that that's an incredibly fantastic way of dealing with such a horrible subject matter, is to add in these kind of 5 points of focus and then carry on with the angst. I mean, as I find it to be very powerful.
It was strange seeing that, you know. But I thought it was brilliant to have these spirituals. They seemed, in one way, out of context, but then they worked and had this allegorical power to them. But it's interesting as well that Tippett went on to go to New York and study jazz more and get into lots of different forms of music later on in life. But it was interesting. This felt like something that just worked, that you wouldn't expect to work.
Well, he believed that the vernacular of the 20th century was jazz. And I mean, if you take the aria, "Ain't Got No Money for Bread," I mean, that's basically Kurt Weill. So, you know, he's completely influenced by jazz.
To do a performance of it at some point with everybody in the hall singing the spirituals, so that it wasn't a them and us as well, but because actually the chorus are basically it's a safety and numbers thing. We will prevail because we're here, and that's what the spirituals are about. I think we will get through the dark side and we'll come through. Despite the world turning, which is one of the texts, you know, despite the fact that this will happen again, we will prevail. And I think it would be wonderful to do a performance with everybody, maybe one day in the future.
No, I think it's a very good idea. I trust that our new director of the Proms is listening. We'll make a note. Well, you can watch this performance of A Child of Our Time on the BBC iPlayer. Now, last night on BBC4, there was a prom dedicated to an inimitable comedian who influenced music, fashion and culture from the day he burst onto the scene, and who continues to do so even after his untimely death in January this year. Here is a clip from the David Bowie prom.
just thought what may.
The Proms' own tribute there to the late David Bowie. So I understand David Bowie was a bit of a hero of yours.
The one rock concert that I ever went to when I was a teenager was Ziggy Stardust in Liverpool in 1972. So what more can I say? I mean, I adored him, and that's most of my age group, I think, huge numbers of my age group, which is why it's a perfect tribute, I think, to have a prom about him.
It's across generations, though, isn't it? Because, I mean, Tom, you're 25, and loads of people I know in your sort of age group love David Bowie too.
Yeah, I've got to say, I came to it quite late. Came to him quite late, which is a shame. But I love his collaborations with Brian Eno. They're so dark and so powerful, and for the time, so unusual. And I find it so powerful and so exciting. And yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that he's on my desk all the time, but he's definitely ticking away in the background.
How about you, Nitin?
I mean, what I love about Bowie is every single decade was different. He changed totally. And I always think when you're making albums, they're like diary entries. They're who you were at that time. And you don't go back and try and fix what you did then, because that's just who you were, and it's pure expression. And that's the thing with Bowie, is he's just constantly evolving in so many different directions. And it's very difficult to say exactly who Bowie was. But I was very lucky recently to be in the company of Tony Visconti, his producer, who was telling me a lot about the passion and the feeling of Bowie for his work, but also the fact with his last album that it wasn't a requiem as many people thought, because he believed he was going to be making another album later on, and it's very sad that that turned out to be his last.
Well, you can be a hero just for one day, or even longer, by viewing the Proms tribute to the original starman that was David Bowie, but only if you go to the BBC Proms website and iPlayer. And that is nearly it for this evening. If you want more Proms concerts, then I must tell you, there are concerts shown on BBC4 on Fridays and Sunday evenings, plus every single prom goes out live on BBC Radio 3. Join Proms Extra next week at the same time, when we'll be taking a much closer look at the David Bowie prom. Maestro Bernard Haitink will be conducting Mahler, and Love is in the Air with Berlioz's Romeo and Juliet. You bring the popcorn, we'll bring the ice cream. My thanks to my guests tonight, to Sue Bickley, to Nitin Sawney, and to Tom Harold. Good luck with Raise. Can't wait to hear it. Hope the rehearsals go really well. Earlier in the show, we talked about new music and how musicians and composers are blurring the lines of musical genres. The cellist Oliver Coates is one such example, and here he is now, performing his own work, co-written with Mika Levy, Baroque Main, which is taken from their forthcoming release, Remain Calm. Goodbye.